teachers, learners, and the different entities present in the learning process that's supposed to be triggered on MOOCs is being pre-configured actually through the dispositive of edX. And we will focus specifically on the discursive material dimension of MOOCs. So the idea would be that we're not just focusing on the discourse about MOOCs, but also on the different material and discursive components that constitute the MOOC itself, and may end up pre-configuring or inviting certain forms of agency among learners, teachers interacting on MOOC forums, basically. Even though the topical focus shifted somewhat, the project is a bit in line with some of my previous research, in the sense that it focuses on questions of agency, subjectivity, and so on, even though for this particular project, together with Francois Lambotte, the professor who's part of this research team, we basically focus on the interface between the communicational and discursive aspects of MOOCs. Now, why would I say that the MOOC is a globalized dispositive, or a global dispositive, or a globalizing dispositive, if you like? Well, this has a lot to do with the scale in which these MOOCs are being implemented. So edX, one of these MOOC platforms, the platform that I will be talking about today, takes as its mission to increase access to high quality education for everyone, everywhere in the world, in order to enhance teaching and learning on campuses as well as online. And so this platform really imagines itself as basically having a kind of global mission, which is also something that's very much visual, an idea that's very much visually presented in a lot of its documents and a lot of its communications. You can see this very clearly in some of the statements that they formulate about themselves on its webpage and so on, but you can also see it in the imagery that's being used, for instance, in the reports that they produce. For instance, on the website, you can find the 2020 impact report of edX, and you see this globe in the background, and it's this image of a globe, a map, a global map is something that pops up again and again. For instance, over here, once again in this document, you see in the background a map of the world, basically, and also textually, they present themselves explicitly as a global non-profit as a global non-profit organization that aims to transform traditional education, supposedly removing barriers related to cost, location, and access. And it even takes as its explicit purpose to develop a kind of global learning community. Of course, recent studies, recent critical discourse studies in particular, they focused a lot on this, these claims made by these platforms in terms of their global impact and so on. And they do point out quite often that, of course, there's a globalization, or there is perhaps a global agenda behind the MOOCs and so on, and the MOOC platforms. But at the same time, of course, location and space still matters. And this is something that you can also even see on the website here, in the sense that there are, of course, certain universities, certain institutions that are highlighted and emphasized as partners in order to give authority to the dispositive itself. For instance, over here, there are clear references to Harvard University, Berkeley University, and then there are over 120 other institutional partners that you can find on the website, but that do not have the same kind of place and space. So what do we want to do with our research project then in investigating this global dispositive called edX? The reason why we focus on edX has to do with the fact that we try to understand how debates, because you have these MOOCs, these massive open online courses, but within the MOOCs, you have these platforms where students can debate with each other, can interact with one another, and so on. And what what we wanted to do with our research project, MOOC Research 2.0, that's the overarching research project within which I take care of one part together with Francois Lambotte. And well, but the overarching assumptions of MOOC Research 2.0 were basically well, the overarching goal was basically to understand why and how debates on what were called essentially contested concepts, or perhaps even empty signifiers, do or do not unfold on these forums. Because as you know, in many courses in the social sciences, in all the social sciences, we have these key signifiers, these key concepts around which debates unfold. Signifiers such as, for instance, culture, politics, and so on. And in each discipline and subdiscipline, you have these other essentially contested concepts over which there are basically discussions, different theories that are being developed, and different definitions that struggle for dominance, and much as is the case with empty signifiers in politics, for instance. So the MOOC forums, basically, and we're particularly interested in MOOC forums with this project because they are the only spaces in edX MOOCs where there's a real possibility of direct interaction between learners, but also between learners and teachers. So the forums, they're basically the only places where we can observe what are called socio-cognitive conflicts in pedagogic theory, where different understandings of these essentially contested concepts in the social sciences clash. And so the assumption underlying a big part of this project was basically that these socio-cognitive conflicts could, in principle at least, be exploited pedagogically if certain conditions were met. And these conditions would be things such as, okay, if students are ready and able to reflect upon, to explain, and to articulate their own thinking on these forums, if they're able to clarify their misunderstandings, and if they're able to scrutinize, to challenge, and to compare each other's ideas, well, in such case, if these conditions are met, well, then these forums can start to play a big role basically in the learning process within a MOOC. However, when we started doing our research, it quickly became clear that we couldn't always identify such conflicts in the exchanges on MOOC forums. And so, in fact, these debates around essentially contested notions in the disciplines of the MOOCs, well, they were relatively rare on these forums. And so we tried, one of the things that we tried to do in our project is to understand why this is the case. There were three observations that pushed us to interrogate the role and the place of the forums in the edX dispositive. And the first one was basically that these debates on these essentially contested concepts do not always take place, or at least not in the amount that we would expect them to, based on pedagogic theory and so on. Secondly, when we see discussion forums, these discussions are quite often limited in length. So most of the posts that people post there, well, they don't get any responses from other students. And those who do get responses, well, quite often they only get a couple of them. And quite often they're limited to posts such as, okay, I agree or I disagree, but there's not always clear argumentation that we can see on these forums, basically. So these discussions are quite often limited in terms of length, but also in terms of depth or quality. And at the same time, we noticed that these forums are quite often also used in other ways, not in order to debate, but rather to give examples or to share experiences, and so on. So we started to realize quite early that if we want to know why these debates are or are not taking place on these forums, we need to understand the role of the forums in the wider architecture of the MOOC and the edX dispositive in general. If you take a look at MOOC literature, though, we didn't really find a lot of perspectives that would help us to do so. One of the reasons being that many studies on these globalizing XMOOC platforms, such as Coursera, Udacity, FutureLearn, and edX, of course, are strongly informed by behavioralist assumptions. And so there's a wealth of publications in the field of pedagogy, but also in the field of computer science about MOOCs. But these studies are quite often oriented towards really the rather utilitarian goal of trying to improve educational processes and results of these so-called XMOOCs, extended MOOCs that try to extend the classic classroom in an open online space, basically. This means that analyses exploring the social and cultural dimensions of MOOCs are relatively rare, even though they are being developed. So there is an overview of MOOC literature written by Eben and Murphy in 2014, they really complain about the lack of social studies that explore the social and cultural dimensions of MOOCs. But since then, we do see that something changed, and by now there are a couple of critical discourse studies that focus on the discourse about MOOCs, for instance. But we also saw a couple of researchers that recently started to develop a kind of socio-material perspective on MOOCs that considers the way in which MOOCs constitute particular forms of interaction. And it's in this tradition that it's not really a tradition yet, but it's this last approach that we would like to contribute, Francois Lambotte and I. So we propose to explore basically the discursive material dimension of edX MOOCs and MOOC dispositives in general, in order to understand the types of interaction that occur there or that do not occur there as well. And so within our own little sub-project of MOOC Research 2.0, we basically try to take to consider MOOCs from the point of view of their communicative constitution. So we focus on the communicative constitutions of MOOC and their forums. And this implies that MOOCs don't only exist for purposes of communication and for exchanging messages within that platform or through that platform, but MOOCs are considered to exist because of and thanks to communication processes, which are always, by definition, simultaneously discursive and material. And this is an idea we get from Gordon, basically. The MOOC is therefore not really seen as just a kind of communication channel, permitting teachers and learners to exchange messages, opinions, or knowledge. It's neither conceived of as a mere pedagogic tool used by supposedly autonomous members of teaching teams that use these tools however they see fit. And we also try to consider the MOOC as something more than a mere digital space or box that has clearly defined boundaries and within which people interact. Instead, we basically, in developing this communicative constitutional view of MOOCs, we try to work with a kind of relational ontology that's also quite common in post-structuralist understandings of discourse or post-foundational approaches to discourse and subjectivity. So the MOOC is then considered to be a kind of entanglement, if you like, of multiple technologies, discourses, and agencies, whose meanings constantly shift and change in the process of their articulation. So when new techniques, new technologies are being developed within a MOOC, as these MOOCs change, as these the meanings and the types of interactions possible on these MOOCs will obviously shift as well. So the pedagogic dispositive that we call edX is basically treated as a kind of heterogeneous ensemble of discursive material elements that are articulated in response to certain societal urgencies. And this is an idea we get from the approach to dispositives developed by Buurman and Schneider and Cabron in 2008 and in 2016. And this means that specific MOOCs, so specific courses, are always the result of an interpretive configuration enacted by a specific pedagogic team, and so of professors and assistants, on the basis of possibilities and limitations offered by the possibilities of the edX platform. And dispositives such as edX then, in that sense, can pre-configure, enable, or invite, facilitate particular forms of pedagogic agency among the teaching teams, but also among the learners. And the idea then basically is that the materiality of the MOOC perhaps does not determine the discourses that circulate there or the meanings that people develop when being active on these MOOCs, but rather that the materiality of the MOOC invites, enables, or permits particular forms of agency rather than others. And this is an idea that we get from the work from Carpentier, basically, who discussed the MOOC as a kind of discursive material knot. And this idea of discursive material knot basically is an idea that Carpentier developed in order to think the entanglement between technology and agency. And he didn't develop this approach out of nowhere. So in developing this approach, he basically drew on actor network theory, which states that objects and things can modify states of affairs and exert a type of agency in the world. And which also states that objects and things are intermediaries implicated in the social through their human connections. But it also draws on, say, the so-called new materialism of Barat in considering agency as a property not just of things, but something that only emerges through performances, and something that only consists in the possibilities that one has for reconfiguring the different entanglements in which we are involved, and that basically configure the worlds in which we live. And thirdly, the third component there is Essex-style discourse theory, in the sense that Carpentier draws on this perspective in order to think of dispositives as articulations of elements, of not just of discursive elements, but of discursive material elements. And the meanings of these elements and the forms of agency that constitute MOOCs would then change continually in the process of their articulation. What then are these discursive material elements that get materialized to different degrees in a MOOC? Well, on the one hand, you could say, okay, even though the distinction between discourse and matter is extremely difficult to draw, you could say, well, different elements materialize to different degrees, perhaps, or gravitate more to the linguistic pole of the discursive material knot, or more to the material pole of the discursive material knot. For instance, if you take a look at a MOOC, there are clearly linguistic and textual elements involved. For instance, there are introductions, there are instructions, there are the course materials themselves. There are exchanges on the forums, which obviously consist of signs, linguistic signs, sentences, and so on. And so you could say, okay, over here we are dealing with an aspect of the MOOC that gravitates more to the discursive side. However, even these linguistic textual elements, they have to material somehow in the MOOC in order to be readable, observable, and so on. And the boundary between linguistics, or the discursive and the material elements is sometimes really difficult to draw. And this becomes especially difficult when we consider multimodal or audiovisual elements, such as clip art, photographs, videos that are integrated there, or even the dashboards that teachers use in order to monitor the activity on their MOOCs. On top of that, there are other discursive material elements that you have in a MOOC, such as identities, roles, subject positions that come with MOOC discursive practices. There are the implicit and explicit rules and regulations that you will find in MOOCs or in MOOC practices. There are the pedagogical ideas and theories that the different parties involved in the MOOC draw on, but there's also the software and the hardware infrastructure, and the fact that, for instance, big data are produced by learners, software, algorithms, ICTs, and an entanglement of all of that. So the MOOC dispositive, and this is why we consider the MOOC dispositive to be really this kind of heterogeneous ensemble. It's not a closed, coherent box with clearly defined limits, but rather this very complex articulation of discursive material elements. And in order to clarify this idea, well, we seek basically in our project to compare different configurations of these material discursive elements in a variety of MOOCs. However, for the purposes of this presentation here, I think we can, well, I think we will basically focus on one particular case study of a MOOC taught on ethics in the domain of psychology, mostly for purposes of illustration, but also because this is still an ongoing research project in which we basically, well, we still have to conduct many of the analyses that we need to do. And so thus far, we find ourselves in a relatively early stage of the analyses, in which we started focusing on this MOOC in the domain of psychology, but that we intend to develop further. So any kind of inputs that you would have, any type of critique would be more than welcome at the end of this presentation. So perhaps a couple of things about this MOOC that we will talk about in a couple of in the upcoming slides. We're dealing with a MOOC in which the teaching team is really little. So most MOOCs, they have like a team of professors, assistants, sometimes of many different professors, multiple assistants. But in this case, everything is done by one single professor who even handles the forums him or herself. There have been several editions of this course, so every year there are several editions of this particular MOOC, and it's basically a 10-week course that is instructor-led, because when you follow a MOOC, there are some MOOCs that you can follow like at your own pace, but this MOOC, you really starts at a particular point, at a particular date, and every week there's another lesson. And so there's a strict course schedule. It's not a self-paced MOOC, and it's a MOOC that was taught in French. So all of the quotes that I will show you, they're basically translated from French to English. So the professor makes use of edX, and this is also important to know, like he doesn't really this professor does not limit himself to edX, but also uses Skype and other course materials, such as a book that this person wrote explicitly in order to give the students something more material to work with than the virtual space of the MOOC itself. In approaching this MOOC, we basically we try to answer this particular research question, which boils down to the following question, okay, how does the edX dispositive pre-configure and invite particular forms of pedagogic agency in specific MOOCs rather than others? And in order to answer this question, we basically developed a research strategy that consists of 3 steps, of which I will only discuss the first 2 ones. First step being an analysis basically of the way the forums are articulated, embedded, or entangled within the architecture of the edX MOOC. And secondly, an analysis of the way the teaching teams, in this case, this single professor, interpret, reconfigure, or reconceptualize the place of the forums in the MOOCs. And for this second phase, I will rely on interviews. For the first step, so the analysis of the MOOC architecture, if you like, we make use of screenshots in order to identify relevant discursive material elements through which the forums get linked to the wider MOOC, to the edX MOOC itself. And here it's important to realize that the teaching team itself can decide if and where forums should appear. So it's not that edX systematically says, okay, over here there has to be a MOOC, over there has to be a MOOC. No, the teacher or the teaching team can decide where to integrate MOOCs themselves. But at the same time, we have to recognize, okay, there's this possibility for configuring the MOOCs a bit, but at the same time, edX has particular affordances and limitations that also exert an influence on the way people can act upon these MOOCs and can express themselves on these MOOCs. And there are a couple of elements that we believe are particularly important to look at. To begin with, the hierarchic structure of the MOOC and the way it's organized, structured as a whole, as well as the navigation and search tools that are available to people following the MOOC. And these elements, these discursive material elements, that have to do with the hierarchical structure and navigation of the MOOC, they're key to understanding the virtual place of the forums, the location of the forums, where they find themselves, where they occur, and so on. Secondly, there's the visual architecture of the forums themselves, because they appear in a particular way. And the way in which they appear, the way in which the exchanges between participants on a MOOC are rendered visually on the website, how they're supposed to send and respond to messages and so on, they also have a significant impact on the type of discussions that we see or do not see on these forums. And so, and thirdly, the third element that we would like to take a look at is the way in which the ideal typical use of the forums is imagined and explained on the MOOCs in pages, for instance, where students get instructions on how to behave on the forums, how the forums should be used, and so on and so forth. A couple of preliminary observations may be in order here, I think. So first of all, one of the things that we noticed was that edX offers a rather hierarchical structure that affords above all a kind of chronological navigation of the MOOC. So people are really supposed to follow different chronological steps by clicking on a next button basically and follow the course in a rather progressive way basically. Also the forums themselves, if you take a look at where they occur, they're clearly anchored to specific sections of the course. For instance, they're linked to particular learning activities chosen by the teaching teams, who may, for instance, invite the students to reflect on a particular question, such as, for instance, in a course on, for instance, negotiation, and they will ask, okay, what does negotiation mean to you, in order to trigger reflections on this concept, basically, and in order to trigger discourses on this notion. But the forums also appear systematically at the end of each lesson, for instance, so that people can ask questions of their own, or are sometimes linked to the course in general. In order, for instance, if you have questions, so there are forums that are specifically meant for people who have questions about the practical aspects of the course, if you like. And at the same time, so this means that the structure of the course has a kind of rhythm in the use of the forums. And so they occur, at least some of the forums occur at certain intervals, at the end of each week, for instance, at the end of each lesson. And this use of the forums has an impact on the way in which debates may or may not develop on these courses, on these MOOCs, because it means that the types of discussions that we see are dispersed across the platform, basically. So discussions can be grouped thematically, but they can also basically, you can have discussions that are basically held about everywhere in different sections, in different forums, in different parts of the MOOC. And this system makes it particularly difficult to form a global impression of the types of discussions we have there. And so it's really difficult to have an overview, especially if you consider that these MOOCs are basically attracting sometimes thousands of students following the same course and potentially interacting with each other on these forums. So the complex hierarchic architecture of the discussions or the forums does not make, on top of that, the complex architecture, and I will try to show this to you with a couple of illustrations, does not make the forum a particularly attractive tool for posting or exchanging messages, especially if you consider the multiple levels of responding, complexity, or posting. 1 second there, because there's a bit of background noise here. 1 second. Brigitte, can you switch off the boiling thing, because it makes a lot of noise? Thank you. Sorry for that. Over here, you see a screenshot. So for this first step of the analysis of the architecture, we focus on different aspects of the structure of these MOOCs. And as you can see, it's a rather dry structure that follows a kind of chronological system. Over here, you can see, you can click on the previous pages, on the next pages. So over here, for instance, we find ourselves in the very first week of the MOOC as week 0, the welcome week, if you like, where people get a general introduction to the course. And for instance, over here, you see a web page where there's a little forum that's launched and where people are invited to present themselves. Who are you? Is the question asked here. And so as you can see, this forum emerges over here, like in a third step. And once you've interacted on the forum or read the forum messages, you can click on next. And the idea is that you progress gradually and chronologically through a course, and at certain intervals you will encounter these forums. If you take a look, there's another way also of accessing the forums, in the sense that it's possible to go to a different section of the MOOC, not to the course section where you get this progressive treatment of the MOOC, but also to a particular session that groups all section of the MOOC that groups all of the discussions together. The discussion page here basically groups at different what they call discussions here, and the different discussions are basically different forums that are launched. As I mentioned before, you have these general forums, for instance, where people can ask for help, where they can present themselves, but that are not linked to particular lessons, if you like. On the other hand, you have forums linked to specific weeks. For instance, over here, week 1, there's a forum called Your Questions about week 1, or for instance, a question asked by the course organizers, where they ask, okay, what does the notion of negotiation mean to you? And then basically you can, over here you have all of these things together. You can add posts, you can search posts and so on, but it's rather difficult, you can already see, to get an overview of the types of discussions that are going on within these forums. Also, if you take a look at the structure of the forums themselves, as you can, it's useful to take a look at this screenshot here. So as you can see, it's a very it's basically a system with different levels. Over here, there's a question asked. Then you can take a look at the posts. Over here, either you take a look at all different posts that are listed chronologically, that each post has a specific topic, or for instance, you can zoom in on a particular post and then people can respond, for instance. So over here, you have a person presenting him or herself, and then you have someone from the teaching staff who responds. And then on top of that, it's possible to produce comments to these responses. So it's really rather complex. On top of that, you have to actively mark whether you want to follow a particular post and the interactions that are going on there or not. There are these little signs that allow you to like a post or to engage in a couple of other actions. But so you have to go through a lot of different steps. On top of that, if you want to post a message, it's really a quite complex procedure, because first you have to say, like, whether you're asking a question or whether you just want to trigger a kind of discussion yourself. You have to identify a particular topic area that has been predefined for you. You have to give your post a title, and then you also have to actually formulate your question or the discussion that you want to launch and submit it. So there are a lot of different steps that basically students have to go through in order to just start discussing, basically. Also, if you take a look at the more linguistic, the linguistic material elements of the MOOC that are more gravitating towards the discursive side, if you like, for instance, the recommendations that exist for the use of the forums, then we see like that we get these contradictory statements sometimes, or contradictory instructions that may confuse things even a bit more. In the sense that, for instance, over here, we see that the MOOC, and I will translate this for you, the MOOC is supposed to be a space that's very interesting, it's supposed to be, or could be an interesting place where basically students can help each other or exchange experiences on condition that they respect the rules and the netiquette, and that they know how to interact on these discussion forums. And then if you take a look at the rules that are being laid out here, you get these instructions that actually go against some of the ideas, some of the pedagogic ideas held by many people developing these MOOCs. So a lot of professors that would like to see students who provide arguments, who who, when they post something, that develop their ideas and so on. But over here, you get these instructions that clearly say that people have to be concise in their messaging, that they have to avoid long messages that are difficult to difficult to read online. And on top of that, they get other instructions like, okay, before you ask a question, make sure that the question hasn't been asked before, which is very difficult to do on these forums where you get hundreds of messages sometimes. People are also incited to respond to each other, but at the same time, as we saw before, the process of responding is really rather complex. I will not really go into this right now. If you take a look at the guidelines that are being given to use the forums, things are also still remain rather complex. So for instance, people do work with screenshots, but there is also contradictory use of terms sometimes. So sometimes the forums are called forums, sometimes they're called discussions, sometimes they're called threads. And so there's a bit of terminological confusion. So there are a couple of preliminary observations that we can get at if we take a look at the MOOC architecture in step 1 of our analysis. First of all, the guidelines that are being given on these forums, they often contain invitations for a particular type of agency on the part of the learners, but these pedagogic instructions and invitations, they're sometimes rather contradictory. For instance, the instructions given on the one hand explicitly ask people not to post these very long messages and so on, but on the other hand, the forums are supposed to be these places for exchanging ideas and helping out one another, and there may be a real tension there. And on top of that, there's this issue of confusing terminology. I see that I forgot to translate this from English, from French. But so, for instance, sometimes the instructions talk about discussions, sometimes about forums, sometimes about threads, discussion threads. And when they talk about posts, they sometimes talk about posts, messages, commentaries. And so this adds a bit to the confusion sometimes. And so our idea is that if you take a look at these contradictory instructions and sometimes this contradictory terminology, we can consider the fact that the type of discourse that's produced on these websites, the discourse of instructions and so on, is actually the result of different actors inscribing their agency into the MOOCs. So for instance, the guidelines and instructions, they're not necessarily developed by the professors of the courses themselves. Quite often, they work with pre-configured materials provided by the edX system and by the local supporting institutions of the university itself. So you have different entities involved in the construction of the MOOC. You have the engineers of Harvard and MIT, for instance, or also the people who are part of the open source community that contributes to the programming of edX. But you also have like local institutions. In the case of the University of Louvain, for instance, you have something called Louvain Learning Lab, which is basically kind of support center for people developing MOOCs. And then on top of that, you have the pedagogic teams of the MOOCs themselves, who can basically ask people to revise the instructions in function of their course. So you have all of these different actors that basically all have particular ideas on what the MOOCs are and what they should be, and who therefore and we can find traces of these different actors' voices and subjectivities in the architecture of the MOOC itself. So far, the architecture, because you have to realize that not all MOOCs are alike. And so there are possibilities.
Sorry, Jan, you're almost out of time, so you have a few minutes more.
Oh, I apologize for that. So I will try to be rather fast. Don't hesitate to interrupt me, Jan. So one of the things that I would like to get at also is that in the second phase, we focus on interviews with members of the teaching teams because we want to know how these actors basically try to materialize their pedagogic ideas, their own pedagogic agency, working with the edX dispositive. And so in the interview that we conducted for this MOOC on psychology, we clearly see that the professor produces a couple of statements that go against official ethics. This, for instance, this person says that the most in-depth aspects of the course that she gives offline cannot be treated within the MOOC because this would make the MOOC too long, which goes against the idea that MOOCs can simply extend the classroom elsewhere without, any quality suffering from that. Also, this person says, well, okay, the MOOCs can be watched a second time online, which is an advantage. But on the other hand, I cannot reframe the message. I can only explain things in one way, which is also limiting in a particular way. And on top of that, this person produces a whole set of critiques regarding the structure of the edX forums. This person describes him or herself as a kind of free electron, stressing a strong sense of agency, saying that she or he really followed her intuition, but was attracted to the MOOCs because they allow for a kind of vulgarization. Nevertheless, it was an individual initiative to start the MOOC, and this person stresses, and this is really important, that ethics does restrain possibilities, but that is at the same time possible to go beyond this dispositive, creatively using, for instance, Skype on the side or developing books, manuals that give students other resources outside of the infrastructure. The major function of the forums, according to this professor, is of a motivational and social kind, so not really meant to develop ideas and so on. This person thinks that the forums are first and foremost useful to establish contact with the students, to accompany them, to show that there's a human presence behind the dispositive, and that forum can also be used to ask specific questions and so on. Nevertheless,
you are out of time, so if you can conclude.
Okay. I will jump to the conclusions then. So ideal, typically, the forum, nevertheless, should look very different. And so this person says, well, okay, people, one of the problems is that people are launching new discussion threads all of the time, and because of the structure, it's very difficult, basically, to get real insight into what's going on there. And so the quality of the interactions and posts is also relatively limited, if you like. So to conclude, the learners are invited to develop their activity in contradictory ways, and we can see this because different actors are leaving traces of their intentions in different ways on these discursive material forums. So I mentioned already MIT and Harvard, different university institutions, and also the members of the teaching teams. And even though ethics offers possibilities and limitations for the development of pedagogic agencies, the dispositive or the architecture of the dispositive does not determine all aspects of a MOOC pedagogic project. Our case study, I think, or this first case study shows that it is possible to create new articulations between elements of the ethics dispositive itself, pedagogic ideas and strategies, and technologies found outside of the platform, such as, for instance, Skype and so on, allowing for new entanglements and new forms of agency to be developed. So even though ethics is clearly a dispositive with global ambitions, it also allows for some degree of reconfiguration that's decidedly local, and that makes a less behaviorist approach to learning not only imaginable, but also necessary, I would say. So this is what I've prepared for you. I apologize for going over my time. I hope that I did not exceed my talking time too much, but I will be happy to receive any feedback or questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was a very inspiring talk. I see people are already clapping virtually in Zoom. So you are a little bit over time, but maybe we have we can have time for one or two reactions. So if you have a question for Jan, please either ask it or write it into chat. Okay, while
I have a question.
yes,
Yeah,
I
yes,
don't
Jan,
know.
thank you very much.
Oh,
I've
yes.
just one. Okay, sorry. Can I speak?
Yeah, 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 please.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Jan. It is very interesting. I've one question. So it is we have all these complex tools, these different new media, which is platforms and teaching and learning tools, but also Zoom and other tools. And these tools have a specific, as you explained to us, a specific function to connect different discourses and to connect different, yeah, so-called material issues, which are not really symbolic. And how would you say are these new tools or these new media? How are these new media connected from your point of view to activities taking place, so to say, outside these tools? Or how is the outside world, for example, social fields or real people or different forms of debates taking place outside the media? How is this outside world related to your
Yeah.
digital tool?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, if I understand you correctly, Jens, because I think uh, when you talk about the outside world and the way it's connected to the MOOC, do you want me to elaborate on the way this is reflected to in the actual discussions going on in these forums, or do you want me to elaborate on the technology itself?
So my question would be, of course, the outside world, a real teacher, a professor, or and some students and so on, they also have an existence outside the media, but they also have an existence within the media. They're represented on both modalities. And my question would be, how does it impact your research on digital media? This obviously the fact that there is something which is outside the media, which is necessarily
Yeah.
which must exist in order to
Oh, yeah.
for the media to exist.
Yeah, true. Well, this issue, I think it touches on different parts of the project. So what I've been talking about today is basically a first article that I've been preparing with Francois Lambotte, and so where we focus on the dispositive itself, so to say. So the way it emerges or the way it appears to the people who enroll for these MOOCs, so to say. However, of course, that thing can only exist thanks to this articulation of this technology, the software, and so on, with and by all sorts of different actors that have an existence outside of this virtual realm basically. So, for instance. In the case of the MOOCs organized by the university where I work at, well, in some cases, well, it's like faculties who actively push professors to develop particular MOOCs for particular programs because of their own agendas and so on. Quite often also for marketing purposes, for making their programs more visible on the international market, if you like. You also have like other institutions within the university that play a role there, like support institutions. You have the community of programmers and so on that could all have an impact on the way in which on the possibilities offered of edX. So there's that side. If you talk about the forum specifically, the outside world will of course have an impact on the content of the discussions themselves. So for instance, one of the MOOCs that we are going to study is a MOOC on international law. And so if you want to discuss the essentially contested concepts and the debate in that field, you have, for instance, the notion of human rights and discussions on human rights, what they are, all of the normative questions that come with that. And so when people are invited to discuss this kind of stuff, they obviously create links with their experiences and their knowledge about the outside world as well. In that case, of course, when we're doing a discourse analysis of what's going on these forums, it will be important to take these positionings into account and to consider why or when and under what conditions and in what ways people rely on these discourses that circulate elsewhere in order to import them or to activate them on the forums themselves. So obviously the MOOC itself should not be dealt with as a kind of closed box, even though it appears to us as such. There is an author who says that basically any type of, who was it again? I have to look up the name, I'm sorry, I can't recall it right now, but there's one of the ideas we work with is that the MOOC, like many other digitalization or digitalized forms of interaction, are basically presented as black boxes, but under which you basically have this very heterogeneous reality that consists of all sorts of connections between material and non-material elements that have their origins outside of what we call the MOOC. Nevertheless, as a user, you have to log in this seemingly closed system, and we think it's part of the analyst's job to deconstruct that black box, basically, and to take a look at all of these connections that make it possible and that constitute it. So that's basically how we try to deal with it. So I hope that this answers your question a bit. But if it's not a satisfactory answer, please let me know, Jens.
Oh, thank you. It's fine to me. It's an open question. It is an open question to me, and I was just interested how you deal with this.
But it's
topic.
not an easy. Like in practice, it's not an easy thing to do because it has to. Like for instance, one of the original ideas of the project was to take a look at these controversies surrounding these essentially contested concepts. Only afterwards we start to realize if you want to know what's going on or not, you need to know what the infrastructure of the system looks like. So that's what we're doing now. So in the second phase, we plan on looking at these interactions. But the problem there, like very pragmatically from an analyst's point of view, is that we seek to compare different types of forums belong to different types of courses. And this means, of course, that we don't have like a single unified type of debate. So we have debates on, say, human rights in the international relations MOOC, or the international law MOOC, for instance. But then we have other MOOCs about, say, corporate social responsibility, where you will have very different notions, of course. And so we're more interested, when we try to solve it, like, well, we intend to compare these different interactions, different types of debates that unfold, mostly also with the analytical focus, not so much of focusing or understanding a particular debate as such on the content level, but rather to see what types of interactions and exchanges we see, and what factors might explain whether a debate is unfolding or not. So that's what we intend to do. But as I say, this is a work in progress.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to close the interesting discussion that emerged right now. We had time for only one reaction. We have 5 minutes or 3 minutes break for people to have some water, coffee, whatever, and then we are continuing with our first media dispositive session. So please use the short break. We will come back in a minute.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, so much for your talk.
No problem. Thank you. See you in a couple of minutes.
See you in a few minutes. So I would like to invite Irina. Hi, Irina. You can maybe
Hi.
unmute yourself.
Yeah, I already did.
Okay, great. Great, thanks.
May I share the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can share the screen. Fantastic. So our first presenter is Irina Dushakova. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank all the organizers for their brilliant job. It's quite hard today to organize such things. So thanks for bringing us all together here, and I'm really happy to see you all. Thank you for the floor. So the topic of my research is the complex infrastructure of media framing. This is a part of the research that I was dealing with during the last academic year, which was dedicated to the framing of the results of opinion polls. And there were two sections in my research. One was dedicated to the text analysis, and the other one was dedicated to the analysis of the process. My basic assumption is that a part of knowledge that is available to broader audiences produced by or in the media. And media, so I choose two functions of the media that I will work with, and they are agenda setting and framing. So I believe that media set an agenda and frame the information they deliver, dictating at these points what the audience should think of and how they should think of what is going on. These two functions, alongside others, are deeply rooted in the complex infrastructure that influences the choice of journalists or editors.